Guys, today my full guide on Chasca, where I will tell you how she works, how good her teams and constellations are, what her best builds are, and so on, so you can have a full perspective on whether or not she's worth pulling for your specific account. So, as you probably already know by now, Chasca is quite a unique bow on field 5-star DPS. She's an anemo carry, but unlike the ones who preceded her, so the likes of Wander and Xiao, her focus is not on anemo damage. On the opposite, she takes advantage of a specific property of her element, namely elemental absorption of Pyro, Cryo, Electro and Hydro, and through that she will deal the vast majority of her damage. This all happens after she uses her elemental skill, which will make her use a gun as a floating vehicle in the most ridiculous looking way possible. This counts as a special stance for her, and just like for other Natlan characters, it's tied to Night Soul Blessing points. Before I get to the damage part, I just want to point out that she seems amazing for exploration, because just like the Wanderer, she can fly, but it seems like she can do it for longer in any part of the Genshin world, so not just Natlan. Going back to the damage part, she can deal damage in two ways, mainly through her elemental skill. Through normal attacks that solely deal anemo damage and as such are rather weak, and charge attacks that can infuse different elements when loaded for a long enough time, more or less similar to the charge time of other bow characters. During her stance, she gets significant interruption resistance, so her having a long load time isn't as bad as it is for characters like Ganyu or Line, for example. These charge attacks load 6 shots in total, and as a baseline, a Constellation 0, 2 of them will be of anemo typing, while the remaining 4 can be either anemo or one of Pyro, Hydro, Electro or Cryo, depending on how your team is composed. In particular, up to 3 of those will change their elements to that of one of the characters on the team, granted it's one of the aforementioned elements. This means is that Chasca wants as many Pyro, Cryo, Electro or Hydro teammates as possible, and this is true because the infused attacks have much higher multipliers than the anemo attacks, so they are the one way she can deal relevant damage, typically. Furthermore, she can convert a 4th shot through her Ascension 1 passive, which gives her a chance at doing that depending on how many different elements out of Pyro, Hydro, Cryo and Electro teammates she has. Keyword here, different. She specifically wants different elements in her team in order to guarantee a 4th infused shot, just like Nuvolette wants different elemental reactions in order to get multiple stacks of multiplier increase on his teams. Not only that, but she also gets an additional damage bonus tied to it, which becomes very significant if you have 3 different elements on the team. This means the difference between having just 2 of those elements on her team and having 3 instead is very large, especially because Chasca benefits a lot from damage bonus specifically. As a character that deals damage of different kinds, she doesn't have many supports that provide damage bonuses that buff the entirety of her damage. The obvious one is Furina, but other than that she doesn't have much, and that makes this passive especially powerful. Also considering that, as I'll highlight later in her build section, attack percent goblets are optimal for her over damage bonus ones. Now, before I move on with her kit, I just want to point out how these restrictions shape her identity in terms of team possibilities at Constellation 0. Again, she really benefits from having 4 different elements on team, which means she can take properly advantage of popular double element combinations like the Shelling Bennett double Pyro core. She's a charge attack damage dealer, and as such she can take advantage of some staple sub-DPS that rely on active character normal attacks like Xingqiu and Yelan. Lastly, since she mostly wants Pyro, Hydro, Cryo or Electro teammates, she struggles to benefit from characters like Shidonen and Kazuha to boost her non-anemo damage. These characters are still strong enough supports that they can be good for her, but they just won't be as beneficial as they are for other characters. This, in theory, can actually be good if it means that she can still be great even without using these highly contested supports, although even in this regard, it's questionable honestly. She still has Bennett and Furina as her best general buffers, both because they are very staple supports by themselves and because they allow her to infuse Pyro and Hydro bullets, which she can trigger melt or vape reactions with. So, even though she's unique, she will still be relying on very common characters to actually be great. One thing I will say though, she will probably bring relevance to some cryo supports because, as I said, she can trigger melt reactions with those cryo shots. So if you're trying to find a new home for your Shenhe, Layla, Rosaria, Chasca might be an unexpected answer for that. Having said this, moving on now, the rest of her kit kind of just follows the baseline her elemental skill has traced. Her elemental burst shoots 6 shots just like her charge attacks do, and all of them will infuse elements based on the same rule I talked about before, so Hydro, Cryo, Electro, Electro or Pyro, with 6 infused elements in total if you have 3 of them on team. It's a very strong attack, but its 60 energy cost for a character that won't have a battery support on her teams for the most part is pretty steep. And that's basically all you need to know about her kit as a whole. Something I want to point out though is that she looks to be very single target oriented, with all of her shots from her charge attacks and bursts only targeting one opponent and having pretty insignificant AoE. This is not necessarily bad, but given that now we have a lot of characters that can deal high damage in AoE, like Nuvolette, Molani, and to a lesser extent, for example, Arlecchino, that does pose the question of whether or not Chasca can compensate for that in other ways. Before I move on, let me remind you that if you enjoy my channel and my theory crafting, but you haven't subbed yet, please consider doing so, because it really makes me notice your support. So, now, moving forward to her team situation and personal damage potential, as I said earlier, she's a very atypical character that wants teams with a complete variety of elements. The very common core of Bennett and Fiorina is, however, still king, as they're characters that can buff the entirety of her damage through their buffs, and as such, they're almost irreplaceable supports for her offensively. Of course though, this only matters if you want to maximize their damage as much as possible. If you find fun in other things, then you do you, you're free to do your choices. Anyway, starting from this duo, she can go a lot of different ways, actually. The new 4-star that will be on her banner, Ororon, is a really good 4th slot because as a Nathan character, it can hold the scroll set to increase some of Chasca's elemental damage and is on top of that a pretty solid sub DPS on an AoE scale. He's good enough that even a Constellation 0 he arguably makes Chasca's best teams. Alternatively, some cryo options, as I mentioned before. Characters like Shenhe and Layla fit quite well here, with Shenhe in particular being a very interesting pick because she can provide a lot of buffs for the cryo hit specifically. Layla is more of a defensive alternative, which might seem not needed if you already have a healer like Bennett on team, but can definitely be useful to still reinforce your defensive utility. Lastly, Shilonen or Kazuha can definitely still be solid choices, although just in range with the other options instead of being outright superior to them if Chasca is a Constellation 0. Her Constellation 1 and 2 change things significantly, however. I will go more in depth on them later in the video, but what they basically do is that they lower the elemental requirements of her first passive by 1. As such, they're massive increases to her output on teams that only have 2 of the main elements, making them potentially better than a standard team's Constellation 0. It's funny to me that with some investment like this, her teams start looking exactly like all other meta teams, throwing out that diversity her base kit has. It's no secret, I dislike constellations like this, so upgrades that completely remove the character's restrictions, but sadly they're becoming the norm in Genshin now. Overall, Chasca is a character with decent teams and personal damage, but this is more noticeable at high investment, because at free-to-play investment it's still good, but it really skyrockets once you get her Constellation 1 or 2, her signature, and things like those. Honestly, I would argue that her single target oriented archetype is mostly fair at high level investment, because at free-to-play level she's decent, yeah, but her personal damage output and her team damage output looks below that of characters like Nuvolette and Molani that are AoE characters, so there is something missing there. This will probably change a bit as we get more Nathan characters that can make our teams better, but for now that's how it is. Speaking about high investment and weapons, let's move to her builds now. Her signature weapon is by far her best option, providing attack, damage bonus, and crit damage. Among free-to-play options, Song of Stillness and the Nathan Craftable are pretty solid, but as I said before, her free-to-play output is just decent, I will say. Artifacts-wise, starting from the stats, attack goblets are really good on her due to how she deals damage of different types, and so no damage goblet will buff the entirety of her damage output. Energy-wise, she will need anywhere between 150 and 170 to burst every rotation on a team that doesn't include a second Anemo character, so no battery. Bursting every rotation is not bad because it deals a lot of damage instantly, but I assume that for most people it's a turn-off to build so much energy on a main DPS. For practical reasons, I suggest to just ignore energy recharge and burst every other rotation instead. Sets-wise, the Obsidian Codex is the best typical choice for damage, with Parachute being a close second if you have Fiorina on team, which is pretty common from what I've shown in the team section. Lastly, about her Constellations, as I said before, they're really good. Her Constellation 1 and 2 just take her first passive restrictions away and then some, increasing her damage massively if you use her on teams with just 2 different elements, and still significantly if you don't. Constellation 2, in particular, makes her throw an extra AoE shot that deals a lot of damage, so it keeps adding on fixing her Constellation 0 limitations. Constellation 3 is a talent level increase to her skill, the main source of her output, so it's good. So, just to lay my final pre-release judgment on this girl, I will say she ranges from just decent to really good depending on how much you're open to invest on her. At free-to-play investment, I will probably place her in that mid-range tier with characters like Clorand or Risley, while at higher investment she ranks much higher, although probably just worse than the very top, like Nuvoletta, Orecchino and Molani. And with this, I'm done for today. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and go check the video I made criticizing the current Constellation and Signature weapon models in Genshin Impact. Bye bye.